They arrived early, the sky above the alpine meadow clear and sharp, the kind of morning that made the world feel untouched and open. The father unpacked their gear while his sons ran ahead, laughing and kicking through the grass, and the air smelled of wildflowers and fresh earth. Everything was ordinary, the calm of a routine summer hike settling over them like a blanket. The stream nearby bubbled along, the only sound beyond the occasional bird call. But as the breeze picked up, something subtle began to creep in. The wind carried hints of sound, faint streaks that could have been distant hikers calling across the valley, but each gust seemed to carry a slightly different tone. One pass through the meadow stretched the noise, pulling it thin, like laughter or shouts stretched on a reel too long. He paused, listening, and for a moment it was easy to dismiss it, a trick of the wind, the valley, or an overactive imagination. By evening, the tones had sharpened. They threaded through the meadow like thin fingers, tugging at the edges of the clearing. The father joked to his sons, trying to sound light, but the sound followed them, rising and falling with the wind, cutting through his words. Each gust carried the same impossible layering, drifting from behind a ridge to the stream and back again, echoing in ways the eye could not track. The laughter, if it could be called that, seemed aware, shaping itself against the valley. When night fully settled and shadows pooled beneath the surrounding trees, the wind returned with intent. The tones weren't faint anymore. They sharpened, distinct and brittle. Even the father felt a chill creep along his spine, a silent warning threaded through the rhythm of the air. The meadow had grown too quiet, too deliberate, as if waiting for something to emerge from the spaces between the wind, the grass, and the stones beneath their feet. Night came faster than he expected, swallowing the meadow in a soft blackness that seemed almost tangible. The campfire had died to embers, the scent of smoked meat fading into the chill air, leaving only the rhythmic rush of the stream and the wind slipping through the tall grass. He woke in the darkness with a start, unsure what had stirred him, the quiet punctuated only by his own shallow breathing. At first, he thought it might have been an animal, or the faint echo of his sons moving in their sleeping bags, but as his ears adjusted, the sound became clearer, impossible to mistake. It rolled over the meadow in layers, overlapping and stretched, a chorus of screaming voices drifting like fog across the valley. Some came from behind the tent, others from across the stream, yet the source could not be pinned. The air was still, but each note cut through it with the sharpness of something alive, something aware of their presence. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound penetrated, curling into his skull, thickening the shadows around him. The screams weren't carried on. The wind. They seemed to rise from every corner of the meadow at once, some impossibly distant, some unnervingly close. His heart began to pound, the rhythm out of sync with the pulsing tension in his chest, and a creeping awareness settled over him. The meadow was not empty. He swung his legs out of the sleeping bag and stumbled toward the flap of the tent, every step soft against the uneven earth. The grass rustled unnaturally beneath his weight, sending tiny shivers up his spine. He flung the tent open, and the night hit him fully. The sky was clear, the moon casting pale light across the alpine expanse, yet there was no sign of anyone or anything. The screaming stopped immediately, mid-breath, leaving an oppressive silence that felt heavier than the sound that had come before. It hung in the air like a held exhale, stretching the tension taut between the tent and the tree line. He stepped outside, the chill cutting through the thin jacket he wore, and every instinct told him the source of the voices had simply vanished, retreating into the shadows. But the emptiness didn't bring relief. It felt deliberate, like the valley itself had exhaled, a warning left lingering in the stillness. Each rustle of the grass, each distant whisper of wind, carried with it a memory of the screaming, embedding unease in his chest. He realized the meadow wasn't just quiet, it was listening, and whatever had made those voices was patient, waiting for the next moment to rise again. Sleep, he knew, would no longer come easily, and morning would reveal more than just flattened grass. Something had awakened in the meadow, and it had found them. Morning broke over the alpine meadow, pale sunlight spilling across the dew-soaked grass, but the usual freshness of dawn felt hollow, almost artificial. The father unzipped the tent, the chill from the night still lingering in the air, and stepped outside, taking in the landscape as if seeing it for the first time. That's when he noticed them. Perfectly flattened circles pressed into the grass, each one smooth and symmetrical, the blades bent in tight, precise curves. They spread around the campsite in deliberate spacing, like someone, or something, had sat or knelt there and left its mark without a sound. The boys ran ahead, laughing nervously at first, but their voices caught on the edges of the morning light as they pointed at the rings. Each of them swore they had heard footsteps circling the tent during the night, but when he bent to inspect, there were no prints, no disturbance beyond the pressed grass itself. The shapes were too precise to be random, each circle perfectly uniform, forming patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, their geometry unnervingly intentional. He tried to shake it off with a laugh, attempting reassurance for the boys and himself, but the meadow felt altered, hollowed out where their camp had been. Every blade seemed slightly bent, every shadow a little sharper, as though the ground itself remembered something that had moved across it in the night. The stream murmured a normal, innocuous rhythm. Birds flitted between the pines, but the air hung heavier than it should have, weighed down by a quiet that pressed in from every side. He stepped from circle to circle, the faint crackle of morning underfoot sounding too loud in the sudden stillness. With each step, the arrangement revealed itself. Concentric patterns radiating from the center of their campsite, lines that could have been pathways or warnings, but pointing to nothing visible. A breeze moved through the meadow, stirring the grass along the edges, but the rings remained undisturbed, as though cemented into the soil. He felt the subtle unease coiling in his chest, the same instinctive warning that had nudged him awake during the night. The morning light illuminated everything, yet the clarity offered no comfort. Instead, it emphasized the impossibility of what had happened here. Something, or someone, had been present, shaping the earth in silent, precise ways, leaving behind a memory of its presence etched into the ground. The father looked around at the stretching valley, the distant tree lines, the serene peaks beyond, and understood that the meadow had been touched by something patient and deliberate, something that observed, moved, and left traces without a sound. The ordinary world he had entered hours ago no longer applied, and he realized with a cold certainty that their time in this place would not remain simple or safe. The second evening arrived with a strange stillness, heavier than any night before, pressing down over the meadow as if the world had paused to watch. The father noticed it first. The silence was too thick, too deliberate, lacking even the usual whisper of wind through the grass. His sons wandered near the edge of the clearing, pointing toward the tree line where shadows stretched unnaturally tall. Shapes stood upright among the pines, perfectly vertical, utterly still. At first, he thought they were trees, trunks warped by moonlight, but the proportions were wrong. Too precise, too human in their posture. He swept his flashlight over the area, the beam slicing through darkness, but the figures didn't shift, didn't sway, and vanished as soon as the light lingered. A chill ran along his spine. Behind him, the grass rustled without wind, a subtle, deliberate disturbance that moved like something living brushing against the earth. The father's pulse quickened. each step toward the edge of the camp sending echoes through the quiet meadow. His flashlight caught glimpses of the tree line again, limbs elongated, shapes rearranging themselves, but always out of reach, always watching. The boys whispered nervously, voices swallowed immediately by the thick, expectant air. The shapes held themselves apart, unmoving yet present, the forest around them bending subtly to their existence. Every instinct told him this was no trick of light, no casual shadow play. The meadow had shifted, grown aware. A breeze picked up for a moment, carrying the faint metallic tang of something unseen, but it died immediately, leaving only the stillness and the presence of those rigid, impossibly tall forms. He circled the tent, checking the flattened grass in concentric rings from the morning, and they seemed to pulse faintly in the pale light of the moon, as though resonating with the unseen observers. The tension thickened with each passing minute, as though the shapes themselves were gauging the family's reactions, marking boundaries the mind could barely comprehend. He wanted to call out, to reassure his sons, but no words would have broken the oppressive hush, and sound itself felt like a risk. Somewhere, deep within the tree line, movement occurred that defied perception. A limb shifted, barely, a flicker of something long and deliberate. The father's eyes darted, but the beam found nothing, only the grass, the tree line, and the emptiness beyond. Yet he felt them, waiting, patient, unyielding, as the night wrapped around them, stretching seconds into eternities. The meadow, which had seemed calm, now hummed with silent attention. And in the distance the shapes remained, statuesque and perfect, refusing to walk, refusing to blink, refusing to disappear completely. Something was approaching, slowly, imperceptibly, and he realized the meadow was no longer a safe place to stand, but a stage on which forces far older and more deliberate than human expectation had begun to act. Night deepened over the meadow, thickening the shadows until the tree line became a wall of black that pressed against the clearing. The screaming had returned, sharper now, closer than it had been before, not distant echoes but rising from the earth itself, layered and unrelenting. The father gripped his flashlight, sweeping it across the grass, and what he saw made his stomach tighten, faint indentations moving in the darkness, bending the blades in slow, deliberate lines that crept toward their tent. At first he thought it was an animal, or some trick of the shifting shadows, but the patterns were too synchronized, too deliberate to belong to anything normal. Each line moved like a body crawling on all fours, advancing in unison, converging from multiple directions toward the center of the camp. The earth beneath his boots vibrated subtly, as if the meadow itself exhaled through the soil, sending a resonance that prickled his nerves with a tactile urgency. He crouched, trying to discern shapes, but there was nothing visible beyond the bending grass and the silent, methodical approach of whatever pressed upward from below. The boys watched in frozen silence, their small hands clutching each other, eyes wide and unblinking, as the father realized that the ground was not inert, it was alive with motion, and it had chosen their position as its focus. Each pulse of movement seemed to correspond with the rising pitch of the screams, a rhythm that the meadow conducted with unerring precision. The air grew dense, every inhalation tasting metallic and cold, the subtle chill gnawing through layers of clothing. The flashlight beam caught nothing but the writhing patterns, yet the presence was undeniable, omnipresent, circling them like a predator that moved unseen. He backed away toward the tent, trying to create distance, but the lines pressed on, relentless, ignoring obstacles and terrain, converging as though their destination was inevitable. His voice caught, unspoken warnings rising from his throat, but the meadow did not respond to words. It responded to fear, to attention, to acknowledgement. Somewhere in the distance, the tree line shifted imperceptibly, the tall, still figures watching silently, connected to the crawling indentations that advanced with patient determination. Time itself seemed to warp, minutes stretching and twisting as the lines continued their slow, synchronized progress. The father crouched beside his sons, breath shallow, trying to rationalize, to convince himself that it was a trick of light, a hallucination born of exhaustion. But the vibration underfoot, the bending of the grass, and the layering of screams proved otherwise. The meadow was active, aware, and its intent was focused. And as the first line reached the outer edge of the tent, converging with the others, he understood, in a gut-tightening certainty, that whatever emerged from the earth would not be delayed, and the space they thought was safe, their tent, their small camp, was already claimed by something patient, deliberate, and impossibly close. The meadow shivered under the weight of night, the grass trembling as if it were inhaling and exhaling in tandem with something far beneath its roots. The father felt it first, a subtle vibration through his boots, a low, almost inaudible hum that rose into a layering of sound, voices that seemed to seep from the soil itself. The boys covered their ears instinctively, but the sound penetrated anyway, clawing through bone, echoing inside their skulls. It was not a scream or a call, it was a chorus, impossible to trace, as if dozens, maybe hundreds of unseen mouths had risen beneath the earth, and each one carried the echo of every scream the meadow had ever heard. The flattened rings from the previous morning began to shift, expanding outward in concentric movements, grass bending, soil heaving as if something below sought release, pressing upward with deliberate, relentless force. The father shone his flashlight along the ground, but he saw nothing tangible, just the subtle undulations of the grass and the dim glow reflecting off dewy blades. But the sensation of movement was undeniable, a pressure that spoke of hidden weight, invisible limbs crawling beneath the surface, inching toward them. Each pulse of sound grew sharper, layered over itself, rolling over the meadow like waves, rising from multiple directions, impossible to localize. The boys clutched each other, shivering, their eyes wide and unblinking, but the father felt a strange, creeping realization. Whatever was rising from the meadow did not belong to the known world. It belonged to the earth, the roots, the soil, and it had waited until they were in the center, exposed and vulnerable. The flattened circles expanded further, their edges rolling outward like ripples, frozen in time, but animated by something sentient. He could feel the vibration through his chest now, each heartbeat syncing with the subtle thrumming beneath his feet, his breathing forced into the rhythm of the unseen chorus. He tried to call to his sons, to draw them toward the tent, but the sound swallowed his voice, the echo returning to him warped, unrecognizable. Above, the tree line stood like sentinels, the figures still rigid, still impossibly tall, now aligned as if in silent acknowledgement of what had begun below. He realized that the meadow itself had orchestrated this, had conducted the rising of voices, the heaving of soil, the bending of grass, all in preparation for a revelation he could not yet see. The ground continued to pulse, the concentric rings stretching further outward, converging slowly, inexorably toward the family, carrying with them a sound that was at once alive and inhuman, familiar and wrong. The air grew thick, each inhalation tasting like iron and frost, clinging to his lungs. The boy's whispers faltered, blending into the hum of the meadow, and he felt a cold, creeping certainty. The voices were not just sounds, they were intelligence, awareness, intention. Something beneath the roots pressed upward, unseen yet undeniable, and for the first time the father understood that the earth itself could watch, listen, and strike in ways humans were never meant to comprehend. The ground beneath them quivered as the chorus swelled, a rising tide of unseen shapes pushing against the surface, bending reality, forcing every nerve into heightened awareness. And in that instant, he knew they were no longer merely in the meadow. They were inside it, surrounded, encompassed, and utterly at the mercy of what waited beneath, ready to emerge with the weight of centuries held quietly, patiently, and now unleashed. They tried to run, moving as fast as the uneven meadow would allow, but the grass ahead shifted beneath their feet, rippling like a massive sheet being lifted from below. The vibration of the ground intensified, resonating through every step, every breath, a rhythmic, relentless pulse that seemed to synchronize with the rising screams. The chorus of voices, layered and unyielding, merged into one unbroken wail that rolled through the valley, bouncing off distant ridges and returning with unnatural clarity, filling the night with a sound that was at once human and impossibly alien. From the tree line, the figures stepped forward, revealing limbs far too long, movements far too smooth, and postures that defied the limitations of flesh. Their skin glistened faintly in the moonlight, pale yet strangely reflective, as though the meadow itself had birthed them from soil and shadow. The father grabbed his son's hands, desperate to pull them away, but the ground betrayed them, each step sinking slightly as if the earth were holding them in place, guiding them toward the center of whatever had awakened. The flattened rings that had appeared over the past 2 days now expanded violently, concentric circles stretching outward in a geometric precision that only something ancient and intelligent could orchestrate. The grass bent and twisted, forming pathways and boundaries, funneling the family toward the approaching figures and the epicenter of the meadow's rising pulse. The screams escalated to a crescendo, a sound so penetrating it seemed to rattle the bones, to claw at memory and instinct, to force every nerve into awareness of the unnatural hierarchy between observer and observed. The father's heart hammered in time with the rhythm of the meadow, his mind racing to comprehend the impossible. The earth itself had waited, patient, silent, cultivating its awakening in the shadows beneath them, and now it had chosen this moment, this family, to witness its culmination. The figures moved with an elegance that contradicted their monstrous proportions, gliding over the uneven terrain without faltering, limbs bending at angles that no human should endure, yet without breaking. As they drew nearer, the ground around them heaved more violently, soil and grass lifting as though invisible hands pushed from below, creating rolling undulations that threatened to topple everything in their path. The father realized the meadow was no longer just a location. It was a living entity, a predator that had learned patience over decades or centuries, and the scream of its chorus was both herald and weapon. With every step forward, the center of the meadow split open subtly, a widening fissure that revealed darkness more profound than night, a void into which the figures seemed partially to sink, emerging and retreating in a rhythm older than memory. The sons clutched each other, frozen with terror, and the father felt a cold, inescapable certainty. They had trespassed into something older than the mountains, something that had waited silently, and now it was awake. The final pulse of screams struck like a wave, vibrating through the air, the ground, their bodies, merging all fear and anticipation into a singular force. And as the father looked up, the first shiver of understanding struck him. The meadow had not merely been waiting. It had been preparing. It had been choosing. And now, in this perfect moment of horror, it revealed itself fully, a conscious, patient, unstoppable presence, swallowing sound, space, and sanity alike, leaving them caught between flight and the irresistible pull of the awakening earth. He pushed deeper into the spruce forest, following the narrow animal tunnels that swallowed the weak light of afternoon, letting shadows stretch long across the mossy ground. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying the faint resinous scent of pine and damp soil, the way forests always smell after the sun slips behind the ridges. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in thin beams that barely touched the trail, leaving patches of dimness that felt heavy, like air held in a lung. At first, the hollows felt ordinary: deer tracks, small burrows, the occasional snapping twig, but then he came upon a massive tree, larger than anything he remembered seeing in these woods, its bark rough and twisted, roots sprawling like the limbs of some ancient creature. A hollow yawned at its base, wide and tall enough that he could stand upright inside without stooping, and a sudden, impossible warmth rolled from it into the cool forest air, carrying a dry, earthy scent and the faint tang of wool. Inside, neatly folded, lay a matted blanket, thick and heavy, strange in its neatness, as though someone had carefully placed it there, and had hummed with residual heat, almost as if it had just been used. He stepped back instinctively, feeling the pressure in the woods press closer, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the exhale of a hidden presence. Every branch seemed to shift in the corner of his vision, every needle on the forest floor aligned with a quiet expectation, and he realized he was not entirely alone. The familiar sounds of the forest, wind through needles, distant bird calls, fell into a sudden hush, leaving only the faint crackle of his boots over the soft forest floor. His heartbeat accelerated, echoing in the hollow around him, yet the warmth from inside the tree called to him, a silent invitation impossible to ignore. He crouched to examine the blanket, noting the slight depression in its fibers, as though someone had recently lain within it, yet there was no sign of movement, no prints, no disturbance in the ground. The feeling of being observed tightened around his chest, subtle at first, then insistent, and he took a hesitant step backward, tripping slightly over a protruding root, reminding him that his senses were no longer entirely trustworthy. The forest seemed to lean closer, shadows bending with an unnatural patience, and a low thrum of awareness brushed against the edge of his hearing, just enough to make him question whether the hollow's warmth and the blanket's presence were real, or a trick of the woods themselves. He glanced around, every direction the same dim, twisting green, feeling suddenly small in a forest that had once felt endless and welcoming. And though he convinced himself the blanket belonged to some hermit or passer-by, something within the hush of the trees told him it was wrong, not simply misplaced, but intentionally left, and that whatever had been here, if anything, was still waiting somewhere beyond, the roots, patient, unmoving, and unseen, holding its breath as he considered taking another step. He set up camp not far from the hollow as dusk settled over the forest, telling himself the blanket belonged to an old hermit, some recluse living quietly among the spruces. The air was thick with the smell of damp pine and decomposing needles, and the ground beneath his boots was soft, springy, giving under each step. He built a small fire, the flames sputtering against the rising humidity, and listened to the woods shift around him, leaves brushing together in the windless silence, branches creaking as though adjusting to his presence. Night grew slowly, a soft gradient from deep green to black, and the shadows between trees lengthened into shapes that seemed to lean toward him just slightly. Then it began. A low, droning melody, faint at first, threading through the trunks and roots in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He paused, listening, trying to place its source, but there was nothing visible, no figure, no movement, only the hum. It was repetitive, almost mechanical, like the vibration of some underground machine, yet organic in its rhythm, pulsing slowly and evenly. Each note drifted closer, circling around his small clearing in the underbrush without a single crackle of footsteps or snapping twig, as though it orbited him with deliberate intent. He called out softly, just his name, testing if it would respond, but the sound only lingered, fading without reply. His fire flickered, shadows dancing across the needles, and for the first time he felt the forest itself listening, aware of his presence, patient, waiting. Time stretched. He glanced at his watch, midnight, and the hum, persistent and precise, had moved to directly behind his tent. He froze, hearing the subtle change in pitch as though it had shifted to follow him, but when he dared to look, there was nothing, only the dark thickness of trees and the faint, quivering light from his fire. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the pull of the hollow and the unanswered question of the blanket held him rooted. The humming continued its orbit, a slow, steady loop that brushed the periphery of hearing, teasing, insistent, like a presence brushing against his consciousness without revealing itself. The forest felt smaller now, the trees bending inward subtly, enclosing the clearing, compressing air and shadow until he could feel the faint pulse of the sound through the soles of his boots, through the bones in his legs, like the earth itself was vibrating in rhythm with it. He wanted to move, to escape, but his feet felt heavy, tethered by something unseen, and the hum grew louder, layering itself into chords that mimicked the cadence of his own heartbeat, aligning with the rise and fall of his breath. For hours, or what felt like hours, he remained frozen, listening as the sound receded in one moment, only to return moments later in a different corner of the perimeter, always close, always deliberate, moving without form. By the first hint of morning, the hum had shifted, retreating slowly into the distance, leaving the forest eerily still, but its memory lingered, stitched into the air and soil, a presence that had circled him and would not soon be forgotten. At first light, he returned to the massive tree, moving cautiously through the spruce forest, where shadows still clung stubbornly to the undergrowth. The air was damp and cool, the faint scent of pine sap mixing with the earthy decay of last night's needles, and every step sounded louder than it should have, echoing across the hollowed-out roots and twisted branches. He expected the blanket to lie as he had left it, folded neatly inside the hollow, warm and waiting as if nothing had disturbed it. But the hollow was empty. Not a fiber remained in the indentation, no traces of movement, no sign it had ever been there at all. His stomach twisted at the impossibility. The earth and roots were undisturbed, smooth beneath his boots, yet the absence of the blanket was undeniable. Then he noticed the footprints, bare, human, delicate against the soft soil, leading out from the hollow into the thicker forest. They were impossible in their configuration, the arches of the feet bending slightly outward, the toes splayed unnaturally, as though whoever had made them had walked while twisting joints in directions human bodies cannot sustain. The prints seemed deliberate, purposeful, positioned as though someone had stood inside the hollow, watched the forest, and then stepped away without leaving a mark elsewhere, leaving only this eerie trail behind. He followed them slowly, heart picking up its pace despite the calm morning air, every snap of a twig underfoot seeming deafening in the quiet. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, attentive and patient, each tree watching, each shadow hovering just at the edge of sight. The deeper he went, the more distorted the prints became, the angles of the feet bending farther, doubling back without turning, overlapping in impossible formations, as if a single presence had folded space with its steps. He could feel the weight of it behind him, an unrelenting pressure in the air, the hairs on his arms rising as the forest seemed to lean closer. Even the usual morning birdsong was absent, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and the soft scrape of his own shoes over pine needles. A low certainty settled into his chest, cold and precise. Something had been here, something that did not belong in the rules of the world he knew, and it was still close. His gaze flicked constantly between the footprints and the hollow, as if expecting the absent blanket to return, as if expecting the watcher to emerge. Every instinct told him to turn back, to retreat to his camp and the semblance of safety it offered, but a compulsion he could not name kept him moving deeper into the spruces, each step echoing in the hollow silence, each pause amplifying the unnatural stillness. And through it all, a faint pulse lingered in the soil beneath his boots, a rhythm like the thrum of something alive, following him, marking him, a presence both patient and predatory, waiting for him to see what should not be seen, and understand the forest had changed the moment he touched the hollow. He followed the trail into the dense spruce forest, compelled by a mixture of unease and a need to understand what had unfolded, each step sinking softly into the needle-strewn floor, muffling the sound of his own movement. The air was cooler here, damp with the lingering chill of night, carrying the faint scent of moss and earth, thick and almost metallic, as if the forest itself had exhaled some hidden warning. The footprints ahead twisted in impossible ways, angles that defied human joints, some doubling back on themselves without turning, others overlapping like a distorted echo of a stride, yet somehow maintaining a continuous path deeper into the shadowed wood. He slowed, careful not to break the delicate impressions, and each glance over his shoulder made him flinch, certain he glimpsed movement in the periphery, though the forest remained still. The soft, pulsing hum that had brushed the edge of his camp the night before returned, faint but insistent, threading through the trunks and weaving around the roots. It seemed to follow him exactly, always behind him, never ahead, a presence without form yet unmistakably aware of every step he took. His boots sank lightly into the soil, and he could feel the vibrations of the hum traveling through the ground, a rhythm syncing with his heartbeat, amplifying the tension coiling in his chest. The shadows between the spruces deepened, bending inward subtly, almost as if the forest itself leaned closer to watch him, to guide him along this path of impossible tracks. Every now and then, he thought he saw the faint impression of the blanket, a hint of warmth or a fold in the earth. But when he moved closer, nothing remained, only the twisting footprints pointing deeper, away from the hollow and further into uncertainty. His senses strained against the forest's silence, the distant call of a bird, the snap of a twig under his weight, the whisper of wind, all amplified, yet none explained the unnatural pattern underfoot. A creeping dread settled in, a certainty that if he continued, he would encounter whatever had left these prints, some entity bound neither by the rules of human anatomy nor the safety of daylight. The hum grew louder in his perception, layering itself into discordant chords that seemed to echo through the tunnels of forest between roots and rocks, pressing in on him from all sides, enveloping him in anticipation, in warning. He realized, with a cold weight settling in his stomach, that he was not simply following footprints, but being led, each twisted step a deliberate message, a path curated by an unseen observer who understood his curiosity, his fear, and his persistence. Somewhere ahead, between the leaning trunks and the dim light filtering through the high canopy, he could sense the culmination of the unnatural trail waiting. A presence that would step into view if he dared continue, patient and inevitable, and the forest held its breath as he moved forward, every fiber of his being aware that the rules of the world had shifted with the pattern of the tracks beneath his boots. He followed the twisted footprints with a tightening knot in his chest, each step carrying him deeper into the dense spruce forest where shadows hung low and the underbrush clawed at his legs. The path narrowed, branches scraping his arms as though guiding him toward something, and the air grew heavier, saturated with the faint metallic tang of damp earth and decaying needles. Then he came to a collapsed spruce, its roots jutting upward like the ribs of some buried beast, the soil around it pressed firm, undisturbed except for the footprints that seemed to end here. There, tucked carefully beneath the roots, lay the wool blanket, wrapped around something, folded and compressed in a way that suggested care, almost reverence. He froze, the hairs on his arms standing as a cold awareness settled over him. This was no random placement. He knelt slowly, every movement deliberate, and his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the canopy, revealing a man curled beneath the roots, shrunken and still, pale as bone, yet impossibly intact. The figure was wrong in ways he could not name, too rigid, too quiet, too deliberately arranged, as if life had been removed and replaced with a careful imitation of repose. The forest around him seemed to inhale, the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig magnified into a tense accompaniment to his heartbeat. Then it began again, the humming, faint at first, vibrating through the soil beneath his boots, thickening with each second, pulsing in layers that reverberated in his chest and teeth. It was louder than before, closer, and he realized it seemed to emanate from the man himself, though his chest did not rise, though there was no hint of breath or pulse. Every instinct screamed to recoil, but curiosity anchored him, eyes fixed on the unnatural sight. The blanket shifted slightly under its own weight, as though something inside it stirred, though the man remained still, rigid and unyielding. He crouched lower, straining to understand, to find some flaw in the illusion, some explanation rooted in reality. But there was none. The humming pulsed in time with the rhythm of his own heart now, layering over it, suffocatingly close, a presence that did not belong to this world or any human hand. His boots pressed into the soft soil, grounding him, yet he could feel the vibrations, the sense that the forest itself had leaned in, focusing attention on this one point beneath the fallen spruce. Every shadow between roots seemed to twitch. Every fallen branch appeared to shiver, as though the forest anticipated his next move, and the blanket's edges whispered against the soil as if something beneath it was alive, listening, waiting. He slowly straightened, drawing in a shallow breath, knowing instinctively that to linger too long would invite an encounter he could not control, that the forest, the humming, and the figure beneath the log were all part of a design meant to be observed but never understood. And as the pulse of sound pressed through the ground, he felt a cold certainty settle into him. Whatever had been here, whatever moved beneath the blanket, was patient, aware, and had been waiting for him to follow the tracks to this exact point. He leaned closer, breath shallow, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil beneath the collapsed spruce, and for the first time took in the full detail of the man beneath the blanket. The figure lay curled, small and rigid, pale skin almost luminescent against the dark roots, jaw slack, muscles unnervingly still. And then he saw the eyes, open, unblinking, glassy, staring upward as if fixated on something far beyond the canopy, yet focused, aware, listening in a way that defied understanding. The hollow under the roots seemed to amplify their emptiness, the irises catching what little light filtered through the spruces, reflecting it back in a cold, deliberate way. He realized the chest did not rise, No breath disturbed the air above the moss and needles. Yet the humming that had followed him since nightfall now pulsed from within the figure, deep and rhythmic, vibrating through his boots, through the roots, through his ribs, as if the sound had been grafted into the man's own body. He froze, every nerve taut, sensing the impossible. Life, absence, and sound intertwined in a way the human mind could not comprehend. The edges of the wool blanket shifted subtly, rising slightly then settling back, though the body did not move, and a cold intuition whispered that the motion was deliberate, purposeful, controlled by something hidden within. He crouched lower, straining to see if the pulsing was an illusion, but every time he blinked, the sensation of vibration strengthened, layered now, discordant yet precise, as if echoing both outside and inside the chest of the man before him. The surrounding forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of birds, wind, and distant creaking of branches replaced by an oppressive stillness, punctuated only by the persistent hum and the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of the blanket. He could feel it in his teeth, in his eardrums, a resonance that seemed to bypass the world and lodge directly into his consciousness, leaving a sense of being observed not just from the eyes above, but from some presence buried deeper, beneath the soil, behind the roots, inside the hollow itself. Every instinct urged him to retreat, to pull back and run, yet his curiosity held him fast, tethered to the impossibility before him. The air grew thicker, heavier, the forest's shadows deepening as the humming layered itself with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, almost taunting, almost coaxing him closer. He moved a hand toward the edge of the blanket, only to halt mid-motion as a subtle shiver traveled through the fabric, like a small, deliberate twitch, unaccompanied by any movement of the body. A cold realization tightened his chest. The sound was not only emanating from the man, it was coming from something embedded in him, something patient, something aware, something that had orchestrated every footprint, every folded blanket, every pull of the forest around him. His skin prickled, mind racing, yet he could not tear his gaze away. The eyes remained fixed upward, unblinking, unyielding, and the vibration of sound pressed further, deeper, inescapable. He understood then, a sick certainty curling in his gut, that the figure was no longer simply a body in the soil, but a conduit, a vessel for the humming itself, and that whatever force was at work had not yet finished, had not yet revealed the full measure of its intent. Every hair on his arm stood rigid, every breath shallow, as he realized the forest had closed around him, focused entirely on the hollow, the blanket, the man whose eyes refused to blink, and whose rhythm of sound refused to stop. He backed away slowly, boots crunching softly on the damp needles, the forest pressing in on every side, yet the humming did not fade. It grew, layering over itself in sharp, discordant pulses that rattled through his bones and seemed to echo inside the hollow of his skull. With each step he took, the sound shifted, synchronized, as if listening, mirroring the rise and fall of his heartbeat, matching the rhythm of his breath, growing louder with the very act of retreat. His eyes darted to the ground. New footprints had appeared behind him, bare and human, yet empty of weight, following him perfectly, imprinting in soft soil as though a second presence walked invisibly in his path. Panic clawed at him, but he forced his legs to move, trying to navigate the narrowing tunnels of spruce and root without breaking stride, knowing instinctively that stopping meant surrendering control to whatever force had orchestrated the forest around him. The trees bent subtly inward as he ran, shadows stretching and twisting, following him, brushing the edge of his vision, framing his escape as if the world itself had been reshaped to funnel him along this path. The blanket under the fallen spruce haunted him in flashes at the corner of his mind. The image of the pale, curled man burned into his memory. The humming, radiating from the figure, now felt like it had grown teeth, sharp and invasive, embedding itself in the ground beneath him, vibrating up into the soles of his boots and through the joints of his legs. Every sound in the forest amplified: the rustle of a branch, the drip of condensation from needles, even the soft fall of earth as roots gave way. But the humming was relentless, omnipresent, a pulse that tracked him with surgical precision, as if the air itself had learned to mimic his movements, breathing in time with him. He glanced over his shoulder, heart pounding, expecting to see the impossible, yet saw only shadow and empty space, a taut silence punctuated by the low, rhythmic vibration following his every footfall. Step after step, it seemed to anticipate him, to toy with him, folding the forest around him, compressing the narrow trails, guiding him through tunnels of root and shadow toward some unknown culmination. The sense of being pursued without a visible hunter became suffocating, a pressure on his chest that made each inhale feel heavy, deliberate, measured. And then he felt it, the blanket unfolding behind him, a soft whisper of fabric against the soil, sliding along roots and moss, moving of its own accord, as if some unseen hand were dragging it, slowly, methodically, maintaining pace with the rhythm of the humming, with the cadence of his racing heartbeat. His limbs burned, lungs tight, but he could not stop, could not slow, each stride drawing him further into the narrowing forest corridor, guided and haunted by the sound that was both external and internal, mirrored and yet independent, following him with uncanny fidelity. He glimpsed light ahead, the trailhead, but even as the clearing came into view, the vibration pressed closer, sharper, the forest narrowing in his perception, compressing the space between him and the unseen conductor of the sound. And in the final moment before he broke into open ground, his ears filled completely with the layered, pulsing hum, synchronized perfectly with his own movement, and he realized, with a cold certainty, that the forest, the blanket, the man beneath the log, and the humming were not just following him, they had become him, inseparable from his own footsteps, inseparable from the rhythm of his being, a presence that would not release him, that had waited patiently all along, marking him, claiming him, and leaving him with no path back to the safety of what he once knew. The hike started like any other. Sun dappling the trail through towering pines, the scent of damp earth and resin filling the air, boots crunching over needles and twigs with a rhythm that felt familiar and safe. 4 of us laughed and argued over who had packed too much, whose water bottle had leaked, and what we'd eat once we reached the last bend. Everything was normal, or at least it felt that way, until we stumbled across the campsite. It was perfect. Too perfect. The fire ring gleamed, stones stacked just so, and the ground inside the clearing was stripped bare, cleared of leaves and debris in a way that looked almost surgical. A narrow trail led right into it, trimmed neatly, edges freshly cut, as though someone had spent hours pruning every branch and root. We froze at the edge of the clearing, trading uncertain looks. The map we'd received at check-in listed 22 official sites, and none of them included this one. Our ranger had been adamant, insisting repeatedly that 22 was the limit, that every site had been inspected, numbered, and logged. Yet here it was, smiling at us from under the afternoon sun, offering shelter and warmth that we hadn't earned. Curiosity collided with caution, and for a long minute none of us moved. The wind stirred, carrying the sharp smell of pine and something faintly metallic, like distant nails scraping against stone. Our voices felt suddenly intrusive, echoing against the dense trunks that circled the clearing like silent guards. One of us suggested moving on, claiming the official map mattered, that someone might be living here illegally. Another shook their head, pointing out the fire ring and the cleared ground, and how easy it would be to pitch tents on such a pristine spot. The sun dipped lower behind the ridge, shadows stretching thin and long across the forest floor, and we realized we hadn't noticed the sound of birds in minutes. No rustling of squirrels, no distant calls from the canopy. The silence pressed against us from every direction. In the end, we set down packs and staked our tents. The fire was built quickly, wood cracking and popping in a small comfort of light and warmth, but the clearing itself seemed to breathe around us, anticipating our presence, testing our willingness to stay. Every snapped twig beyond the glow of the flames, every shadow brushing across the edge of our vision, felt deliberate, measured. We laughed again, half-heartedly, trying to push down the prickling sense of being watched. Yet something inside me noticed the subtle wrongness. The way the clearing seemed older and younger at the same time, the way the wind's direction shifted without reason, the way the trees leaned just enough to funnel attention toward us. The sun finally sank behind the ridge, and the forest darkened with a weight that felt almost physical. For the first time, I realized that choosing this site wasn't just a minor decision. It was a crossing, a point where the rules we'd trusted, maps, rangers, logic, stopped mattering. And as the firelight flickered across the pristine ground, I had the sinking certainty that this campsite had chosen us, just as much as we had chosen it. Night fell fast, folding the forest around us like a closing lid, and at first it felt comforting. The way the dark swallows the horizon, quieting the world and keeping us together in the glow of the fire. We laughed, tossing jokes at each other and feeding logs into the flames, sparks spiraling upward into the thick, dark canopy above. The warmth from the fire made the shadows dance across our faces, stretching our movements into long, ridiculous caricatures, and for a while, the forest felt alive only with our voices. But as the hours passed, the night grew colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that seeps through sleeping bags and jackets and makes the skin crawl with the hint of something waiting unseen. By 1 a.m., the laughter had thinned, our words swallowed before they even left our mouths. The firelight cast shadows that reached far past the trees nearest to us, twisting into impossible shapes that didn't align with the branches or our movements. Every snap and crackle of burning wood seemed exaggerated, deliberate, as if the forest itself were listening, responding. I caught movement at the edge of the glow, a flicker that could have been a deer, a shifting bush, but it wasn't. My friends saw it too, the sudden pause in the night, the way everything beyond the circle of fire seemed to hesitate. The temperature dropped sharply again, the wind carrying the scent of wet soil and something faintly acrid, like smoke long extinguished. Our voices faltered as the first shiver crawled along my spine, and then the silence came. Total, complete. The usual night chorus, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of nocturnal life, the distant call of an owl, disappeared in a heartbeat. It was as if the forest had held its breath, waiting, folding the night around us. Laughter ceased entirely, swallowed by that quiet, and even the fire seemed smaller, less protective. Every crackle of flame sounded amplified, too sharp, too conscious, as if the fire itself were warning us. A branch cracked somewhere behind the tree line, deliberate, slow, and the shadows seemed to twist inward, converging toward the firelight rather than away from it. We sat frozen, glancing at one another, the weight of unspoken acknowledgement pressing down on all of us. Something had noticed us. It wasn't animal, not completely, not human, but aware, patient, circling in the dark. The cold seeped into bones and thoughts alike, and though the fire roared between us, it no longer felt like protection. Each of us stared into the tree line, waiting for a sign, a sound, anything, while the night itself pressed closer, like the forest was expanding inward, filling every empty space around the campsite. And then, just as abruptly as it had come, the forest's breath held us suspended in that moment, leaving only the firelight and the knowledge that this night and this sight was not ours to command. Something waited beyond the shadows, and we were beginning to understand that it had all the time in the world. Dawn arrived like a quiet accusation, pale and thin, spilling over the ridge with a light that felt wrong, too weak to reach the edges of the campsite. The fire ring, which had gleamed the night before, sagged inward, stones blackened and crumbling as though decades had passed while we slept. Moss crawled over the ground where bare dirt had been, weaving between our footprints, erasing them before our eyes, soft and insistent. Our tent stakes were rusted, metal flaking away in dusty curls the moment we touched them, and the fabric of the tents themselves sagged as if exhausted by some unseen weight. Backpacks and gear looked older too, faded and frayed in places they had not been, zippers stiff and brittle, plastic cracking along edges that had seemed perfectly fine the night before. We tried to rationalize it, blaming condensation, cold, or the shadows, but the evidence refused any explanation. Every glance revealed more decay, pine needles falling like brittle confetti over our already weathered supplies, a gust of wind that smelled metallic and cold scattering leaves across the ground in precise arcs, as if someone or something had orchestrated it. My stomach churned as I traced my own footprints and found them partially buried by new soil, like I had been walking across a campsite that had existed for decades rather than hours. The trees pressed closer at the edges of the clearing, taller, older, their bark rougher and darker than memory suggested, creating a tunnel of distorted perspective that funneled our eyes back toward the campsite center. The air felt heavier, saturated with dampness, and a faint, indefinable scent of decay that was not yet rot but carried the promise of it. The forest seemed aware of our disbelief, almost amused, pressing against the fragile logic we clung to like a lifeline. I touched my gear again, my fingers brushing against a cooler that felt wrong, so much lighter, so much older, as if it had been handled by countless hands over untold years. Each item whispered its own story of accelerated age, teasing at the impossibility before me. Time had fractured here, shifted and bent into something beyond comprehension, and we were trapped inside its cruel experiment. We stepped away from the tents and the fire ring, trying to find grounding, looking toward the trail we had followed yesterday, but the forest itself seemed to have rearranged. Trees standing in places that made no sense, gaps that didn't exist the night before. The campsite wasn't just aged, it had aged around us, dragging our memories into its timeline, leaving us to question every step we'd taken. And as I felt the wind brush past my face, carrying the brittle scent of pine and earth that had somehow turned old overnight, I realized with a chill that whatever was happening here wasn't going to stop, and that the forest was no longer simply a backdrop for camping. It was the architect of something far older, far crueler, and it was waiting for us to notice how little control we had. We thought leaving the campsite would be simple, a matter of retracing our steps along the trail, but the forest had other plans. The path we had followed the day before was gone, swallowed by towering pines that stood in perfect, unnatural alignment, creating narrow corridors that funneled us relentlessly back toward the clearing. Each turn we took, every deviation, brought us to the same exact spot where our tents stood, as if the forest had folded in on itself. Branches overhead creaked in a rhythmic pattern, subtle at first, then louder, like deliberate knocks counting time, marking our missteps, confirming our inability to escape. Our phones flickered in our hands, screens sparking static, time readouts jumping randomly, 1:03, 2:47, 12:11, numbers cycling with no logic, as though mocking our reliance on technology. The light through the canopy dimmed and shifted. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, bending and leaning toward the interior of the forest rather than away from the sun. Every familiar landmark twisted subtly. The same bend in the trail became a narrowing tunnel of trees. A familiar rock appeared where no rock had been. Moss thickened on logs we knew had been bare. The air felt thicker here, humid and heavy, with the scent of decayed wood, soil, and something metallic that had no source. Our attempts to call for help returned only echoes of our own voices, warped, delayed, like we were speaking into a vast empty hall rather than a forest. Anxiety built with every step as the corridors constricted, and the forest seemed to lean in closer, guiding us back to the campsite that was decaying even faster than before. When we finally stumbled into the clearing, our stomachs turned. The fire ring had sunk further into the ground. Charred wood had collapsed into ash. Our tents appeared older, threads fraying, fabric sagging. Gear had further deteriorated, zippers frozen, nylon brittle, metal oxidized. Every object seemed to have been subjected to decades in the span of hours. The forest pressed in from all sides, unyielding, with a deliberate patience, the rhythmic creaking above us acting as a metronome, measuring our helplessness. Even the air held tension, thick with the scent of rot and pine, as if inhaling wrong notes could unravel us entirely. We backed away, hearts racing, only to find the corridors reappearing when we tried to leave, trees aligning into passageways that funneled us straight back again, inescapable and precise. Time felt fractured. Our steps echoed in empty spaces that didn't exist moments before, a cruel loop in which the forest dictated reality. Every rational explanation slipped away with each repeated turn. The campsite was no longer just a place. It was a center of a force that bent the forest, twisted the hours, and made sure we understood we weren't merely lost. We weren't visitors here. We were intruders in something far older, far more patient and far less forgiving than we could comprehend, and the forest waited, watching, while the corridors closed around us like the jaws of a trap. The decay was impossible, and yet it happened faster than we could process. Our equipment, which had survived the first night intact, began to collapse under our very hands. Coolers split along seams as if frozen over decades. Metal tent poles flaked into rust before our eyes. Nylon straps and fabric snapped and frayed with a brittle sharpness that made us flinch. Every item we touched felt older than it should, soaked in the scent of rot and damp earth, yet dry to the touch, as if it had been left to wither in the elements for years, compressed into hours. Shadows had grown too long, stretching past our bodies and leaning inward toward the forest, pointing at us instead of following the sun. The firelight no longer held dominion over the clearing. It flickered against walls of darkness that seemed alive, undulating with shapes we could not name. Our voices carried strange echoes, bouncing back with a delay, as if we were speaking inside a hollow cathedral, each syllable warped, stretched, and unfamiliar. The forest pressed in, patient, indifferent, and we became acutely aware of the sound of footsteps just beyond the tree line. Soft, deliberate pacing. Not running, not frantic, but the careful, quiet steps of someone, or something, that had been observing us for longer than we realized. Every time one of us reached for an object, it resisted, crumbling in our hands, the decay accelerating as if the forest demanded it. The low hum of unease grew, wrapping around our skulls, whispering that our presence here had a cost, that we were intruding on a rhythm older than our understanding. A branch snapped behind us, close enough to make our hearts leap. But when we turned, nothing moved. Yet the pressure persisted. The way the trees leaned, the weight of the shadows, the suffocating certainty that our very time here was being rewritten. Even the fire behaved differently. Flames flickered without wind, casting angular, grotesque shapes that seemed to ripple across the ground. Each shadow danced with intent, pointing toward the interior of the forest as if guiding unseen entities closer. A low breeze carried the acrid scent of metal and rot, stirring pine needles that scattered across our gear like brittle ash. I tried to speak, to warn the others, but my words came back delayed, stretched, hauntingly familiar yet alien. The footsteps continued, steady, patient, and I realized they were not meant to chase us. They were meant to watch, to measure, to mark our presence before time itself reclaimed us. We were losing control, losing reference points, every attempt to flee, returning us to the same collapsing clearing. The campsite had become a nexus where decay and shadow coexisted, stretching years into minutes, warping reality and leaving us to understand, with a horror that gnawed at the edges of our minds, that this forest had been waiting for visitors like us for far longer than any of us could have imagined. As dusk bled into full darkness, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees leaning as though pressing down on the campsite, holding us in place, forcing us to witness what came next. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, shadows twisting into vague shapes along the tree line, but then the outlines solidified, and I realized we were not alone. Between the trees, faint figures emerged, spectral and incomplete, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the fire's glow. They were like echoes of people, or perhaps versions of campers we had once passed on trails years ago, frozen mid-motion in states that should have been impossible. Some were young, vibrant, their clothing pristine and tents perfectly pitched. Others were older, frail and skeletal, skin drawn tight over bone, their faces hollowed and eyes sunken. And yet they all faced us, waiting silently, unnervingly patient, like employees clocking in for a shift in a place that existed outside the normal rules of time. Each outline flickered and shifted, younger, older, skeletal, then young again, cycling in loops that our minds could barely comprehend. I blinked, and one figure stepped closer, the air folding inward, heavy and pressurized, like a collapsing room trying to squeeze the world into itself. My stomach lurched as I realized the forest had become an observer as well, every branch, every rustle of leaves moving in concert with these figures. The cold that had been seeping through the evening thickened into something almost tangible, pressing against my skin and searing through my thoughts. The firelight seemed to shrink, no longer illuminating the clearing, leaving only partial glimpses of these campers, fragments of the impossible made real. Their eyes, or the spaces where eyes should have been, followed us with deliberate attention, and I knew we were intruding, trespassing into a time and space that had been meticulously maintained by forces beyond comprehension. Every attempt to speak or call their attention failed. Our words echoed into nothing, stretched, delayed, returning with unfamiliar intonations, as if filtered through decades or centuries of unseen layers. Branches overhead creaked in a deliberate rhythm, matching the silent pacing of the figures along the edges, their presence growing heavier with each passing minute. I realized the looping cycles were teaching us something, or testing us, measuring our reactions, counting our fear. We moved as one, hesitant, backs pressed together. Yet every step we took seemed anticipated, corrected by the forest itself. The figures did not chase, did not speak, did not gesture, but their very existence forced us into obedience. Shadows stretched toward them and away from us, pointing at corridors that did not exist, twisting our perception of distance and direction. Even our clothes and gear seemed to age subtly with each heartbeat, threads thinning, fabrics dulling, metal rusting, as though the presence of these previous campers carried with it the weight of time itself. I could feel it pressing against the inside of my skull, the recognition that we were witnessing the residue of lifetimes, that the forest, the clearing, and these watchers had been keeping count long before we arrived. And as one figure finally shifted its weight, stepping closer, the air trembled, folded inward, and I understood with a primal certainty that what we were seeing was not just a warning or a memory. It was a demonstration, a glimpse into a rule of the forest we had broken, and there was no guarantee we would leave intact, unchanged, or even whole. The final hours, or perhaps centuries, stretched before us, as if the forest itself had decided that time would no longer follow any natural rhythm. We huddled in the center of the decaying campsite, hearts hammering, breaths short and uneven, as everything around us accelerated into ruin. The fire ring crumbled, stones disintegrating into dust under the pressure of some unseen clock, the ash scattering across the forest floor like powdered memory. The picnic table sagged, the wood soft and rotting, nails splitting and falling away. Our own gear seemed to dissolve with the passing minutes. Jackets thinned to nearly nothing, threads fraying, packs falling apart in our grasp, buckles rusting in the space of a heartbeat. Even the tents sagged completely, fabric falling to the ground in wrinkled tatters, poles warped and twisted beyond recognition. Time itself had become a tangible force, pressing against our bodies, stretching seconds into decades, decades into seconds, leaving us suspended in a cruel loop where the normal rules of existence no longer applied. Every word we tried to speak returned, delayed, hollow, echoing as if the forest itself had stolen our voices and warped them through some unseen conduit. The shadows grew longer, extending across the clearing and into the corridors of trees, pointing inward, pulling the edges of our perception toward the interior of the forest where light could not reach. Shapes moved there, figures of previous campers, caught between states of youth, decay, and skeletal abstraction, cycling endlessly, their eyes fixed on us, waiting for recognition, for understanding. For the moment, we realized that we were not merely witnesses, but participants in their perpetual stasis. When one figure stepped closer, the air shifted as though the very atmosphere had weight, folding inward, compressing our lungs and pressing cold against our skin. I reached for a pack, and it fell apart entirely in my hands, zippers corroding, fabric disintegrating into dust, and the metallic scent of rust and decay burned my nostrils. Every movement we made seemed anticipated, mirrored, corrected by the forest's invisible hand, guiding us back to the center, back to the point of collapse. And then the wind carried a sound, soft, deliberate, a shuffle that was neither animal nor fully human, around the perimeter of the clearing, circling us in an orbit of patience and inevitability. The ground itself seemed to pulse with the passing years, rising and falling as moss and leaf litter spread unnaturally over our footprints, covering our intrusion with layers of time we could not measure. We stumbled backward, trying to escape, but each step led us only deeper into the cycle. The forest bent and folded around us, impossible corridors reappearing, shadows pointing, figures flickering, the decay accelerating. I realized then that whatever rules governed this place had nothing to do with hours or days, and that we had trespassed into a mechanism that measured life and decay as a single, unrelenting pulse. And as a second figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, indistinct yet horribly deliberate, I understood that leaving would not end the cycle, that time itself had become a cage, and that we were now counted among the watchers and the watched, trapped in a forest that did not know how to release anything it had claimed. Not even us, not even our fleeting hours, now stretched into endless, decaying decades. I entered the canyon late in the afternoon, backpack heavier than usual, but otherwise expecting the familiar chill of the narrow pine walls and the strange wind tunnels that had earned this place its reputation. The sun had begun to dip behind the ridges, painting the pines in long, trembling shadows, and the canyon floor was mottled with dappled light that shifted as the wind threaded through the trees. I had heard the stories about the whistles here, about the drafts that carried tones like voices, but I thought it was exaggeration, the canyon playing tricks on the imagination. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine resin, damp earth, and the subtle metallic tang of melting frost. It felt like any other late autumn hike, quiet, controlled, ordinary. Then, just as dusk folded fully into the canyon, the first whistle drifted through the trees. 3 sharp, deliberate notes, spaced almost like punctuation, followed by a hollow pause that seemed too intentional to be carried by the wind. My steps faltered, ears straining, scanning the pines for the source, but the sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I waited, holding my breath, thinking it might repeat or fade, but it did 2 more times, the pattern exact each pass, 3 notes, silence, 3 notes, silence again. There was an unnatural precision to it, too clean, too rhythmic to be wind passing through branches. A shiver crept up my spine, the canyon narrowing in my perception, the pines closing around me in a way that felt deliberate. With each echo, the forest seemed to hold itself in place, the usual murmur of birds and insects gone entirely, as though the canyon itself had gone silent to listen. I checked my watch. The seconds ticked forward, yet it felt as though time itself had slowed, stretching to match the cadence of the notes. I tried to convince myself it was an animal or a trick of the wind through the ridges, but the precision gnawed at reason. By the 3rd repetition, the sequence ended abruptly, and the canyon fell silent in a way that felt heavier than absence. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant cry, just the weight of stillness pressing against my chest, the sort of quiet that carries attention, anticipation, and something else I could not name. I stepped forward, heart pounding, every footstep cracking the needles under my boots like a confession. I tilted my head, listening, trying to catch the trail of sound, but the canyon seemed to fold over itself. Shadows deepened unnaturally. A breeze, or the memory of the breeze, passed through, carrying the faintest echo of those same 3 notes, just enough to make me glance over my shoulder. Nothing moved. The canyon walls, the twisted pines, the narrowing path ahead, everything appeared unchanged. Yet I felt the weight of awareness pressing in. It was no longer wind. It was a signal, deliberate, waiting, and the night that had just begun held its breath as if the canyon itself was listening to, whether I understood. Morning arrived with a brittle light that slipped between the pines, cutting the canyon into jagged lines of shadow and pale gold, but it brought no comfort, only a lingering tension from the previous night's whistles. I stepped out of the tent, boots crunching on frost-damp needles, scanning the area around my campsite as though the forest might reveal its secrets in the early sun. That's when I saw it. A fresh carving on the trunk of a nearby pine. So precise it looked almost deliberate, almost human in its intention. 3 long slashes, then a gap, then 3 more, identical in spacing to the whistle's rhythm I had heard the night before. My stomach lurched, a slow sinking sensation, because the alignment was too exact to be coincidence. I crouched to examine the cuts, tracing the grooves with my finger, but the bark was smooth, cleanly removed, no ragged edges, no signs of rushed work. Whoever, or whatever, had made them had taken care, and the pattern matched the sound I had heard as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I rose slowly, scanning the surrounding trees, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, expecting something to step into the clearing, a figure that had orchestrated both the sound and the mark. There were none, no footprints anywhere, just the scattered needles of the forest floor, pressed flat under my boots, disturbed only by my own passage. The canyon felt suddenly smaller, walls pressing inward with each breath I drew. As I circled the trunk, searching for additional carvings or tracks, a faint whistle drifted through the pines again. I froze, my ears straining. It was the same 3-note sequence, but this time closer, almost teasing, as if acknowledging that I had seen the marks. The wind didn't shift. No branches rattled, no animal stirred. The whistle was deliberate, perfectly timed, threading through the canyon like it had a mind of its own. Gooseflesh pricked along my arms as I realized that the canyon was no longer just a corridor of trees. It had become a conduit, amplifying whatever presence had been watching, sending its message in sound and symbol simultaneously. I wanted to follow the noise, to chase it deeper into the pine shadows, but an instinct stopped me. The same instinct that had kept me awake half the night, listening for the faintest repeat of the 3 notes. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally against the canyon walls, longer and sharper than my own weight should have allowed. And then, as if the forest were testing my awareness, the whistle sounded again. Same pattern, same spacing, yet this time it lingered just beyond the line of sight, a breath away from the edge of the trees, too close to dismiss, too precise to ignore. I swallowed hard, the taste of cold metal in my mouth, and forced myself to move forward, tracking the edge of the canyon with my gaze fixed on the tree carvings, each mark a silent reminder that I was being watched, measured, and acknowledged by something I couldn't yet see. I followed the canyon wall, moving carefully along its uneven base, eyes glued to the bark of each pine as the light slanted lower, brushing the forest floor with long streaks of shadow. Every step felt measured, deliberate, as though the trees themselves were shifting subtly under my gaze, guiding me towards something I didn't want to find. New markings appeared further along the canyon, carved deeper into the trunks, a spiraling downward in tighter arcs, curling almost like arrows pointing toward the ground, toward a direction that demanded attention. They were more intricate than the first set, each loop and slash methodical, intentional, a visual echo of the 3-note rhythm that haunted my ears. I scanned the ground for signs, footprints, broken needles, displaced soil, but the floor was pristine, untouched, and every mark of human passage seemed erased by design. I crouched, running my fingers along one of the spirals, tracing the grooves that sank into the bark, and the pattern felt almost alive, almost communicating with me without sound. A chill drifted through the canyon, brushing the back of my neck, carrying the faintest hint of the whistle that had started all this. But it wasn't wind this time. There was no gust, no shifting branches, only the repetition of that rhythm echoing faintly off the canyon walls. The 3 notes carried on a cold draft that seemed directed, shaped, as if the canyon itself were exhaling in a pattern meant for me alone. The deeper I went, the more the forest pressed in. The trees seemed closer, their shadows thickening unnaturally, blocking the remaining light, bending it around the spirals. My heartbeat quickened as I noticed that each new symbol appeared to descend in perfect alignment with the previous, forming a line that led downward, almost dragging the eye, almost pulling me towards something at the canyon floor I could not yet see. I forced myself to keep moving, careful not to step too heavily, feeling the quiet weight of observation that had been building over the last 2 days. The wind, or whatever passed for wind, stirred again, but the notes were different now, longer, dragging, more resonant, echoing the shape of the carvings as though the sound was following the form on the trees. Gooseflesh prickled along my arms as I realized that the canyon was no longer a place I could traverse casually. It had become a deliberate trap, a measured space where sound and symbol intersected to pull my attention, to manipulate my presence. I could hear the hollow whisper of movement just beyond sight, and the 3-note draft lingered, faint but unmistakable, reminding me that someone, or something, was aware of my every step, waiting for me to interpret the message correctly. My stomach sank as the descending spirals seemed to press me forward, forcing my gaze downward, deeper into the narrowing canyon, toward a darkness that was not just shadow, but something denser, something aware, and I realized that the marks, the sound, the weight of the trees, they were all aligned to draw me closer to whatever waited at the end of their path. By the time sundown stretched its long, sickly fingers across the canyon, the air had grown colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves had exhaled and trapped the day's warmth. I paused near a bend in the pines, hearing it again, the whistle, but this time it was different. Longer, wetter, forced, like breath pressed through clenched teeth, straining against some invisible barrier. My chest tightened as the notes repeated with the same rhythm as the carvings. 3 sharp tones, a pause, 3 more. Each echo perfectly mirrored in the canyon's narrowing curves. I froze, scanning the shadows between the trees. They moved subtly, shifting like something just beyond clear sight. Branches bent slightly, needles quivered, but nothing fully emerged. Nothing stepped into the clearing or broke the pattern of shadows on the forest floor. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once, following me, matching my pace, and as I turned toward my small camp tucked into the canyon's side, the canyon itself seemed to funnel the sound straight at me, compressing the notes into the space around my ears. Each repetition pressed against my chest like a pulse I couldn't escape. My breath caught. The scent of pine resin mixed with damp soil and a faint metallic tang, and the forest felt aware. Every step I took toward the trees made the sound shift slightly, always staying a step ahead, always just out of reach. I tried to dismiss it as wind, as some quirk of echo, but the wet rasp of the notes, the way they pressed against the air, betrayed something deliberate, almost communicative. My boots crunched softly against fallen needles, but there was no rustling beyond them, no visible source. I stopped and listened, hearing the 3-note pattern repeat slower now, dragging across the canyon like an animal stalking its prey, yet it wasn't moving in any direction I could detect. The shadows thickened, stretching in unnatural angles, folding into themselves, as if the canyon walls were bending inward, guiding my attention. I felt my heartbeat accelerate, an erratic drum under the calm rhythm of the whistle, and the hairs on my arms rose as I sensed movement in the periphery. Something pacing just beyond sight, something aware of my every decision. The canyon had shifted from a passage of wind and echoes into a vessel for a presence I could neither see nor fully understand, compressing the sound, the air, and the shadows into a trap. I tried to step closer to the wall, closer to the source, but my foot caught on a root that hadn't been there, as if the forest itself had shifted beneath me, subtle but precise. The whistle continued, long, wet, deliberate, brushing the edges of my mind, syncing with the descending spirals I had traced along the tree bark. And I realized that every sound, every shadow, every shift in the canyon was designed to pull me deeper, to guide me towards something that had been waiting all along, just beyond my perception, pacing perfectly in time with the carved pattern I could no longer ignore. The canyon held its breath around me, and I understood I wasn't just being watched, I was being led. Darkness fell hard, swallowing the canyon in a cold, oppressive silence that pressed against the skin, and I retreated into my small tent, unzipping the flap with hands that trembled despite my efforts to stay calm. The nylon walls rustled with every subtle shift of the wind, or whatever passed for wind, and immediately I felt it. Movement outside, deliberate, slow, circling. It wasn't fast, not like an animal fleeing or hunting. It was measured, patient, aware, dragging just beyond my direct sight, but close enough that the scrape of needles and soft brush of the forest floor reached my ears with impossible clarity. Each time it passed, I could hear a faint exhalation, timed perfectly. Every third rotation aligning with the three-note rhythm that had haunted me since the first evening. My heartbeat thumped in response, every pulse syncing with the sequence of breaths, the cadence of invisible footsteps moving just beyond the walls I had thought would protect me. I crouched lower, trying to steady my nerves, telling myself it was just the canyon, the wind, an echo. But the dragging sound halted suddenly, directly behind the peak of the tent, and the fabric seemed to quiver with anticipation. I froze, the nylon pressing against my cheek as I strained to listen, realizing the pauses weren't random. They were deliberate, almost communicative, counting off in perfect rhythm with the carvings etched into the canyon trees. I dared not move, afraid that even a single shift would betray my presence, and yet the air itself seemed alive, heavy with observation, bending toward me, following me, reacting to my heartbeat. Somewhere in the darkness, the dragging started again, slower now, circling the tent wall, brushing the edge of the nylon as if testing its resistance. The three-note rhythm persisted, over and over, now carried not by wind but by the forced, strained breath of something that seemed impossibly human and impossibly wrong. My chest tightened as the steps dragged around the perimeter, every third pass lining up with the sequence that had haunted my waking hours and dreams alike. A sudden scrape, a heavy press on the opposite side of the tent, and I realized it was close enough to feel the heat of its presence, and I could not tell if it was hunting or simply playing, testing me, acknowledging my awareness, marking its dominance in silence. The forest around me held its breath, shadows pooling unnaturally against the pines, as if the canyon itself were conspiring with this unseen thing to trap me inside the thin walls. I wanted to move, to crawl out and run, but my body refused, frozen by instinct and fear. And then the dragging stopped just behind my head, closer than I had imagined possible, leaving only the faint metallic taste of cold air in my mouth. A silence so absolute that my ears began to ache, ringing with the absence of the rhythm. I could feel it there, waiting, aligned with the three-note cadence, perfectly still yet undeniably present, and I realized that the canyon, the tent, and the carvings were not separate. They were a single mechanism, and I was the center of it. I emerged from the tent at first light, the pale canyon light filtering through the pines, and immediately noticed it. New spirals carved into the tree closest to where I had slept, fresh and deep, sinking into the bark with a precision that made my stomach twist. They were more intricate than before, descending in a continuous line that pointed deeper into the canyon, guiding the eye toward the narrow shadows between the trunks, as if the forest itself were directing my steps. I crouched to inspect them, running a fingertip along the grooves, feeling the smoothness of the cut and the faint damp of sap, a sharp contrast to the roughness of the surrounding bark. There was no jaggedness, no hesitation in the strokes. Every line was deliberate, exact, almost purposeful. My gaze darted around, scanning the canyon floor for footprints, broken needles, disturbed soil, anything to explain the origin of these carvings, but there was nothing. The forest floor remained untouched except for my own tracks, and even my senses questioned the reality of what I saw. I moved cautiously toward the new line of spirals, noting how each twist of the mark seemed to descend like a finger pointing into the earth, pulling me toward a place I didn't want to go but couldn't resist. My backpack felt heavier, but I ignored it, gripping the straps as I followed the spiral sequence deeper into the narrowing canyon. The silence was almost total, yet I could sense something circling, just out of sight. The same three-note rhythm that had haunted my nights persisted, carried on a breeze that didn't exist, brushing against my ears with unnatural precision. I paused, straining to locate its source, and my stomach sank. My food bag, which I'd carefully hung and secured, sat in plain view, untouched, and yet the rope that had held it taut was cut cleanly, a sharp line where tension had been removed without a sound. I stared at it, disbelief rooting me to the spot. The wind was still. No animal tracks, no human footprints, not a hint of disturbance beyond the carvings themselves. A faint whistle drifted down the canyon, soft but deliberate, carrying the same rhythm, now slower, as if counting each spiral in the bark, measuring me, reminding me that I was being followed. Gooseflesh prickled along my arms and neck as I realized that every mark, every note was coordinated, as though the canyon had become a sentient guide, leading me while simultaneously observing. I tried to steady my breathing, shaking off the mounting tension, but the air felt viscous, heavy, loaded with the weight of unseen eyes. Every step forward pressed me deeper into a sense of inevitability, the descending spirals a trail I could neither ignore nor retrace. Somewhere behind me, the faintest scrape sounded along the forest floor, just beyond the tree line, deliberate but silent enough that I couldn't locate its direction. The whistle carried again, slower, waiting, and I sensed that whatever orchestrated this pattern, this rhythm, this unseen choreography, was now expecting a response. My fingers itched to touch the carvings again, tracing the spirals, feeling the direction they urged me to follow. The forest around me seemed to pulse in time with my own heart, compressing the canyon walls, bending shadows, and folding sound into the gaps between trees. I realized with a cold certainty that I was being led, through the air, the marks, the rhythm, deeper into the canyon's intent, into something waiting, patient, and entirely aware of my presence, and for the first time, I understood that the three-note rhythm was no longer just a sound. It was a guide, a lure, a counting pulse of something far larger than the canyon itself. I followed the spirals reluctantly, each step measured, my boots pressing into the needles on the canyon floor as the walls of pines closed around me like ribs, compressing the space until the air felt thick and warm, though the morning chill lingered stubbornly. The three-note whistle had resumed, low and deliberate, following my pace almost perfectly, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat, each note a pulse that reminded me I was being observed, measured, guided. The canyon narrowed further, shadows stretching unnaturally, curving with the contours of the spirals etched into the trees, each marking seeming to reach for the ground as if pulling me downward, deeper, toward something unseen. I wanted to stop, to turn back, to shake the feeling of inevitability pressing at my shoulders, but a force I couldn't define tugged at my chest. A magnetic pull woven into the rhythm of the whistle and the lines of the carvings. The air itself seemed alive, the canyon exhaling in sync with the three-note pattern, brushing cold against my skin, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my throat dry. My ears strained for the smallest sound beyond the rhythm, and I thought I heard something shifting behind me, just beyond the trees. Soft, deliberate, but impossibly silent at the same time. Every step I took was mirrored by a change in the whistle, a subtle shift in pitch or timing, and I realized that whatever was producing it was not passive. It was aware of me, tracking my movement, responding to it, anticipating it. I pressed forward, each step taking me deeper into a narrowing canyon where light struggled to reach, and the forest seemed to fold in, branches leaning like sentries, shadows pooling unnaturally against the pines, creating shapes that suggested movement, figures just out of reach. The spirals on the trees tightened, forming near vertical lines that almost became arrows, pushing my gaze downward, forcing me to follow the path they delineated, and the whistle followed each twist, each turn, its notes dragging slowly as if counting me along, coaxing me forward. My throat tightened, pulse hammering, every nerve on alert as I realized that the canyon was no longer merely a landscape. It was an instrument, a mechanism designed to guide me while simultaneously hemming me in, shaping my attention, my movement, and my fear. I sensed the breath of whatever was behind the sound now, closer, pacing in perfect synchrony with the three-note rhythm, brushing the edges of perception, teasing the line between wind and living presence. The canyon walls seemed to shift subtly with each step I took, as if responding to my hesitation or boldness, bending the shadows to guide me. When I finally stopped, exhausted, heart hammering, the whistle stopped too. Silence fell instantly, heavy and expectant, pressing against my ears and skin alike, and for the first time I realized the source had paused deliberately, waiting for my next move. I could feel it there, just behind me, just out of sight, perfectly aligned with the rhythm, waiting for me to acknowledge it, to follow it further, to answer whatever unspoken question the carvings, the spirals, the canyon, and the breath-like whistle had posed. I stood frozen, knowing the canyon itself had caught me, and that the three-note rhythm had brought me to the precise point it wanted me to reach, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the narrowing pines, I sensed the presence had drawn a line in the canyon, and I was standing squarely at its end. I stepped cautiously, every sense straining, as the canyon walls pressed closer, the narrowing pines bending shadows into impossible angles, and then I felt it. A single, sharp shift in the air behind me. The first three-note whistle, slow and deliberate, began to rotate around me, though there was nothing visible, nothing tangible that could move in such a precise arc. It felt alive, conscious, adjusting to my position as if it had measured my stance and now traced my location with surgical care. One by one, the surrounding echoes, once distant then closer, converged, circling me, aligning with the descending carvings I had followed for hours, each note now resonating as if calling my name, though the sound carried no words. My heart thumped in violent counterpoint to the rhythm, each beat matching the forced, strained whistle, and the canyon itself seemed to tighten around me, compressing the space until the shadows folded in unnaturally, creating pockets of darkness that moved with a life of their own. The spirals on the trees seemed to shift in perspective, guiding my eyes upward and downward simultaneously, disorienting me, and I realized that the whistle was not just following me. It was orchestrating me, manipulating my movement through space, bending the canyon to some unknown design. The air thickened, cold and metallic, carrying the faint tang of iron and wet earth, and I felt the presence behind the sound, pacing, circling, waiting. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee the suffocating, narrowing corridor, but my legs moved as if compelled by something outside my control. Stepping forward, compelled by the descending spiral of carvings and the perfectly timed rhythm that had dominated every night and day I had spent in this canyon. The whistle intensified, dragging along the walls of the pines, merging with the creaks of branches, the whisper of disturbed needles, the subtle groan of the canyon itself. And then I saw them, not fully, just in the corner of my eye. Pale shapes, elongated shadows that flickered between the trunks, aligning with the whistle's cadence, pacing in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat, yet never fully revealing form or substance. My chest tightened as the final, horrifying realization settled over me. The canyon, the carvings, the breath, the shadows. They had all been guiding me here, toward a convergence I had no chance to anticipate. The whispers of movement, the dragging rhythm, and the three-note cadence now pressed directly against my skin, wrapping me in a pattern of sound and motion I could not escape. I stopped, trembling, and the canyon fell silent for the first heartbeat. And in that moment I understood that every mark, every exhalation, every spiral had been a lure, a signal, a mechanism to trap my presence. Then the whistle resumed, slower, deliberate, encircling me completely, and the shadows seemed to condense into a form that was both everywhere and nowhere, focusing entirely on me. I could feel it there, right behind me, waiting, and I could not turn fast enough to face it, yet I knew I had been seen, marked, and measured. The air pulsed with expectation, the canyon itself holding me in the center of its dark, meticulous choreography. And in that suspended moment I realized with a cold certainty that the whistle had converged, and I was utterly, undeniably the point of its attention.